Behind the doors of a frozen northern palace, a secret is unraveling. The southern prince was never meant to survive the road north, poisoned, silenced, buried before he ever reached the altar. Instead, he wakes up wearing a stranger's memories, wrapped in silk, staring straight into the eyes of the very king he was sent to betray. The whole court believes he tried to die rather than marry a monster. None of them know the poison was murder in disguise, or that the man lying in that bed isn't the villain they married off to be executed. He knows exactly how this story is supposed to end. So why does his first move look less like fear and more like seduction? Stay with us to find out exactly what he's really planning. Get comfortable, because this is the story of Julian, the villain who was supposed to lose, and somehow ended up melting the coldest king in the north instead. If you've ever had to charm your way out of a room you really weren't supposed to survive, tell us about it in the comments. The last thing James Calloway remembered was the wind. That particular Chicago in November wind that cuts sideways off the lake and finds every gap in a cheap department store coat. He'd stepped out onto the fire escape outside the 41st floor break room because his phone was at 11% and his boss was still screaming about the Hartley account inside. And honestly, freezing to death seemed marginally more appealing than another hour of that. He was 29. He had $600 in checking, a web novel open in one tab and a resignation letter open in another, and a badly rusted railing that gave way the second he leaned on it to read one more chapter. He'd grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Cicero, with a mother who worked doubles at a diner and a father who left before James could walk, and he'd promised himself, every year since he was 14, that this was going to be the year things got easier. It never was. He'd majored in accounting because it was practical, taken the first job that would sponsor his student loans, and, somewhere in 6 years of 80-hour weeks and performance reviews delivered by people 10 years younger than him, he'd stopped promising himself anything at all, the only thing that had felt like his. Lately, the only hour of the day that belonged entirely to him was the half-hour before bed when he opened a web novel app and disappeared into somebody else's kingdom, The Omega King's Downfall, Chapter 214. He never got to find out what happened in 215. There was falling. There was a sound like the whole world exhaling, and then there was warmth, thick, golden, smelling of beeswax and lavender, and a voice sobbing so hard it kept catching on itself. "My prince, oh, thank every saint in the sky, you're breathing. Please open your eyes." James opened his eyes. He was staring up at a canopy of dark green velvet, held up by 4 carved wooden posts thick as tree trunks. Sunlight came through leaded glass windows in narrow gold ribbons. His body ached in a way that had nothing to do with hitting pavement, a deep, bone-level exhaustion, like he'd run a marathon in someone else's legs. Because, as it turned out, he had. Kneeling at the bedside was a young woman in a plain wool dress, her eyes swollen nearly shut from crying, twisting a damp cloth in her hands like she meant to strangle it. "Where?" James rasped. His own voice came out wrong, deeper, rougher, edged with something feral he didn't recognize. "Where am I?" The woman went white as the pillowcase. "My prince, do you not know me? It's Nora. I've dressed you since you were 12. Her chin trembled. "Has the poison taken your memory, too?" Poison, prince, and then it hit him. Not gently, the way memories are supposed to arrive, but like a second fall, a second impact, this one entirely inside his skull. A flood of borrowed memories crashing over his own, a name that wasn't his, Julian Ashby, a kingdom called Meridian in the south, a father who flinched whenever he looked at his second son, an older brother whose smile had never once reached his eyes. And underneath all of it, unmistakable even to someone who'd only just arrived in this body, the low, ever-present hum of an alpha designation, coiled tight under his skin like a second heartbeat. James, no, Julian now, he supposed, had read this. He'd read every single word of it on his phone at 2 a.m. with his cat asleep on his chest. The Omega King's Downfall, 214 chapters of court intrigue and slow-burn tragedy, and he had transmigrated directly into the body of its most infamous character, the villain, the doomed second prince of Meridian, sent north as a political bride to marry the fiercest and most feared Omega monarch in the known world, King Gabriel Sterling of Windermere. In the book, Julian arrived at the northern court already hated, a southern alpha forced to marry an Omega king as a calculated humiliation, meant to make the whole kingdom seethe at the insult of it. He was supposed to steal war plans for his father, He was supposed to be cruel to the people who tried to be kind to him. He was caught, tried, and executed in chapter 340, and the whole court cheered. James had cried reading that chapter. Now he was living the 20 pages before it. The healer says it was a miracle you survived the poison, Nora whispered, dabbing at her face. Everyone in the palace believes you drank it yourself, that you'd rather die than marry the Omega King. They've got it backwards, Julian thought, staring at the canopy. They always do. Because he remembered, the book had told him, buried in a flashback nobody paid attention to until it was too late, that Julian hadn't poisoned himself at all. One of the Northern honor guards, escorting him across the border, had lost his entire family to a Meridian raid years before, and he could not stomach delivering a Southern viper to his king's bed. He'd slipped wolfsbane extract into Julian's wine at the last border inn. If the timeline held, King Gabriel, cold, brilliant, terrifyingly thorough Gabriel, would already have uncovered the truth, which meant he was coming here, now. The doors of the bridal chamber slammed open hard enough to rattle the windows. King Gabriel Sterling, 26 years old, ruler of Windermere for 4 years, since his parents were killed in a border ambush during a fake peace summit. An Omega, though nothing about him has ever once suggested delicate. He fought his own war council to a standstill before he was old enough to grow a proper beard, pushed Meridian to the brink of collapse in 18 brutal months, and only agreed to a truce because his kingdom's coffers were bleeding out faster than its enemies were. Cold in council, ruthless on a battlefield, and, according to every rumor in the capital, incapable of love, having buried it with his parents, he filled the doorway the way a storm fills a horizon. Tall, broad through the shoulders, dark hair pulled back hard enough to show the sharp architecture of his face, a black wool coat with silver wolf's head clasps that caught the light like teeth. His eyes were a pale, glacial gray, and they went straight to Julian's face like a blade finding a gap in armor. James understood instantly and completely why Book Julian had fallen for this man on sight. It was genuinely unfair. Nobody should be allowed to look like a Renaissance painting and also be capable of ending your bloodline in an afternoon. Gabriel dismissed Nora with one sharp flick of 2 fingers. She fled, the doors shut, and then it was just the two of them, and the low, dangerous hum of an Omega whose scent, cedar and cold rain Julian noticed distantly, the way you notice weather, filled the whole room like a held breath. "You're awake." Gabriel's voice was low, controlled, and entirely too gentle for the fury sitting just underneath it. He crossed to the bed and, to Julian's genuine shock, went down on one knee at the bedside, not a courtly gesture, but the low, watchful crouch of someone checking a wound. He took Julian's wrist without asking. 2 fingers pressed to the pulse point. His scent spiked, sharp and metallic, when he felt how fast Julian's heart was still going. "My investigators finished at dawn," Gabriel said, still holding his wrist. "It was not suicide. One of my own border guards poisoned your wine. He acted alone, out of grief for kin your father's army killed 6 years ago." His jaw tightened. "I am telling you this myself so you do not hear a worse version of it from someone else." Julian blinked. In the book, this scene had been 2 lines long. Cold, transactional, Gabriel informing his new husband of a political inconvenience and nothing more. It was not supposed to feel like this. It was not supposed to feel like a king kneeling at a bedside with his thumb resting, absent and unthinking, against the inside of a stranger's wrist like he needed to feel the proof that he was alive. "I have a request," Gabriel went on, releasing his hand with visible effort. "Do not send word of this south. If your father learns a Windermere guard tried to kill his son, the truce breaks, and every man, woman, and child in both our kingdoms goes back to burying their families by spring. I will deal with the guard myself, quietly." In the novel, Julian had agreed instantly, desperate to please the man he already loved. James was not that man. James had spent 6 years being screamed at in open-plan offices and had exactly 0 interest in martyring himself for a stranger's convenience. "No need to punish him," Julian said. Something shifted behind Gabriel's gray eyes, surprise quickly buried under suspicion. "I did not know Meridian bred such mercy." "It's not mercy. I genuinely do not care what happens to your guard." Julian pushed himself up against the pillows, arms crossed, doing his best impression of a man who had not 5 minutes ago been sobbing about missing his cat. "But I'm not giving that away for free. If I keep your secret, I want something." Gabriel's whole body went still. That particular stillness of a predator recalculating. And what does a Meridian prince want from me? To be left completely alone. Julian met those gray eyes and did not look away, which, judging by the flare of Gabriel's scent, was apparently not something people did often. No war councils, no banquets, no pretending to be a husband. Treat me like furniture and we'll get along fine. For a long moment Gabriel simply studied him, searching, visibly, almost helplessly, for the trap. He didn't find one, because there wasn't one. James just wanted a nap and possibly a hamburger, in that order. Done, Gabriel said finally, standing so fast his coat snapped like a flag. And then quieter, almost to himself, as he reached the door. That is not what I expected you to ask for. He left. Julian collapsed back against the pillows, heart absolutely not still racing from the ghost feeling of a king's thumb on his pulse, and thought, okay, new plan, survive, eat well. Do not under any circumstances fall in love with the terrifying Omega King who is contractually obligated to have me executed by chapter 340. He was already quietly, catastrophically behind schedule on that last part. Nora became convinced within a week that the poison had scrambled her prince's entire personality, because the Julian in the history books wept nightly for a husband who ignored him. This Julian slept 11 hours a night, woke at noon stretching like a cat that had never known a deadline, and treated the royal stipend like it had an expiration date. He bought silk in 6 shades of the same blue because he liked all of them. He commissioned jewelry nobody had asked for. And on his 3rd day as a married man, he marched into the royal kitchens and found the head cook, a broad, nervous man named Aldous Finch, 41, 20 years in service, deeply suspicious of foreign princes bearing diagrams. Your Highness, Aldous said, holding Julian's crayon sketch at arm's length like it might bite him, you wish me to coat this chicken in seasoned flour and then submerge the entire bird in boiling oil. Every piece. Trust us to the process, Aldous. If it explodes, it will not explode. It will be the single greatest thing this kingdom has ever produced, and I will double your wages if you nail it by Friday. It did not explode. It was, in fact, a religious experience. Julian ate an entire plate alone that first night and nearly cried into his napkin, and by the following week half the kitchen staff had started sneaking pieces on their breaks. He named the dog he adopted from the stable yard, a filthy, fearless terrier mix with one ear that never stood upright, Biscuit, in honor of the whole enterprise, and Biscuit repaid him by following him everywhere, including, memorably, into a council meeting Julian wasn't even supposed to be attending. He hired the palace's worst, most melodramatic theater troupe to perform overwrought romance plays in his courtyard 3 nights a week, and started inviting the junior maids to sit on cushions and shout commentary with him. He did not just discover she's his stepbrother's secret twin. Biscuit, unbothered, slept through all of it. What Julian did not know, what he wouldn't learn until much later, was that every single evening, a folded report of his day's activities landed on King Gabriel's desk. The Southern Prince spent the afternoon eating fried food, watching an amateur theatrical production about a cheating merchant, and shouting commentary while a small dog slept in his lap. Gabriel read every single one. He would never admit, not even to himself, how much he looked forward to them. The one time Julian was dragged into an actual state function, a harvest banquet he'd been assured, falsely, would be brief, went about as well as everyone should have expected. He'd been seated 3 chairs down from Gabriel, close enough to watch the king field an hour of tedious toasts with a face carved from stone, and by the second course, Julian had lost the thread of a border tariff conversation so thoroughly that Biscuit, smuggled in under the tablecloth against every possible rule of court etiquette, had become the far more interesting conversational partner. It went fine right up until Biscuit, overexcited by the smell of roast pheasant, launched himself out from under the table and directly into the lap of the Meridian ambassador, a stiff, humorless man named Lord Pruitt, who had spent the entire evening making pointed remarks about Southern discipline, knocking a full goblet of red wine directly down the front of the man's ceremonial robes. The hall went dead silent. Lord Pruitt stood, dripping, purple with fury, opening his mouth to launch what was very obviously going to be a diplomatic incident. He does that, Julian announced into the silence, scooping Biscuit up before anyone could suggest anything unfortunate happened to him. It's a Meridian custom, actually. Very old. Wine blessing. Extremely good luck. You should feel honored. There was no such custom. Everyone at the table knew there was no such custom. Lord Pruitt, still dripping, looked deeply unconvinced. And then, from the head of the table, King Gabriel, stone-faced, unreadable Gabriel, made a sound none of the assembled nobility had ever once heard him make in 4 years of formal dinners. He laughed, hard enough that he had to set down his goblet, hard enough that half the hall didn't know whether it was safe to laugh along or not. "A wine blessing," Gabriel repeated, wiping his eyes, entirely unable to stop. "Of course. My deepest apologies, Ambassador. My husband is very devout." Lord Pruitt was given a new robe, a formal apology, and a case of the North's finest wine to smooth things over, and the incident was never mentioned in any official record. But Julian noticed, walking back to his chambers that night with Biscuit tucked contentedly under one arm, that Gabriel had fallen into step beside him without being asked, close enough that their shoulders brushed the whole way, and hadn't stopped smiling since the wine hit the floor. "You didn't have to walk me back," Julian said. "I wanted to see if you'd invent a second custom to explain it," Gabriel said, and there was something warm and unguarded in his voice that hadn't been there a month ago. "I find I look forward to finding out what you'll say next. It's an inconvenient habit to have developed about one's political hostage. I'm not a hostage. I'm a guest who happens to be legally married to you. A distinction," Gabriel said, "that grows less convincing every day. Prince Oliver Sterling, age 7. Gabriel's only living sibling, kept quietly out of public view since their parents' deaths for his own safety. Fiercely protective of the few people he loves, deeply unimpressed by titles, and possessed of a scream that can apparently be heard 3 floors away. Julian met him 3 weeks in a quiet corner of the palace gardens, tossing a ball for Biscuit while a small shape hovered behind a rosebush, like it thought itself invisible. "You can come out," Julian said without looking up. "He doesn't bite, mostly." A boy stepped out. Dark hair like Gabriel's, the same pale eyes, dressed too finely to be a servant's child. "Can I play with him?" he asked, chin jutting out in a way that dared Julian to say no. He said yes. 20 minutes later, the two of them were sharing a platter of fried chicken Julian had summoned from the kitchens, Oliver narrating an epic saga about his brother, the greatest warrior in the whole world, who apparently never had time to play anymore because he was always talking to old men with beards about taxes. "Sounds exhausting for him," Julian said. "Lucky for you, you've got me and Biscuit now." That was the exact moment the garden gate exploded open. King Gabriel arrived at a dead run, sword half drawn, face bone-white with terror, and in one motion he'd put himself bodily between Julian and his little brother, as though Julian were a viper coiled to strike. "Gabriel, wait." Julian caught himself, hands raised. "I didn't know he was your brother. I swear I didn't." Gabriel's eyes flicked to the greasy plate on the bench, and Julian watched the terror curdle into a different kind of fear, the kind that thinks poison before it thinks anything else. Julian grabbed a drumstick off the plate and took an enormous, aggressive bite, chewing like his life depended on it, which, given the sword, it might have. "Not poisoned," he said around a mouthful. "Just fried chicken." Before Gabriel could say another word, a small hand fisted in the front of his coat and yanked, hard. "Brother, you're being rude," Oliver announced, scandalized, glaring up at the most feared monarch on the continent like he was a naughty stable boy. "Julian shared his chicken and let me play with his dog, and you never have time for me, and the one time somebody's nice to me you come in here screaming." The man who had brought Meridian to its knees stood there, sword still half drawn, thoroughly and completely dismantled by a 7-year-old. A laugh cracked out of Julian before he could stop it. He turned it into a violent cough, northern air, very dusty. Gabriel's eyes cut to him, and there it was again, that thing underneath the ice, something Julian didn't have a name for yet, but that made his own scent, alpha and involuntary, curl warm and interested in the back of his throat. After that, Gabriel started requiring Julian's presence in his study every afternoon. He never explained why. He simply worked, buried in reports, low-voiced meetings with grim-faced counselors about a treasury bled dry by decades of war, while Julian sat on a couch in the corner and was, for once in his life, told to do nothing at all. At first, Julian assumed it was surveillance. "You really don't have to babysit me," he said once. "I couldn't find a war map if you handed me one with a bow on it." "Sit down, Julian." So he sat, and because there was nothing else to do, he watched. He watched afternoon light slide gold across the sharp line of Gabriel's jaw, watched him frown at ledgers with the same intensity he'd once turned on a battlefield, watched him absently push a strand of dark hair back from his forehead without ever once looking up from his work. Oh no, Julian thought, with the specific sinking dread of a man watching his own downfall in slow motion. He's unfairly gorgeous. This is a war crime. He slapped himself hard across the face. Gabriel jumped, startled out of his ledgers for the first time in an hour. What are you doing? Mosquito, Julian lied. Huge one, carry on. The weirdest part wasn't the staring. It was that Gabriel started doing it too. Julian would look up from a book to find those pale eyes already on him, and Gabriel would look away half a second too slow to pretend it hadn't happened. He started having the kitchen send up honey cakes every afternoon, setting the plate down beside Julian's couch without comment before returning, wordless, to his desk. Julian started noticing other things too, the way you notice a change in weather before you can name it. The way Gabriel's whole posture eased, just slightly, the moment Julian walked into the study, shoulders dropping half an inch like a held breath finally let out. The way he'd started keeping a second inkwell and a spare quill on the corner of his desk nearest the couch. In case, he said, when Julian once idly wondered aloud whether he could borrow paper, as if he'd been waiting for the excuse to have something of Julian's permanently within reach. The way his scent, cedar and cold rain, warmed at the edges into something almost like wood smoke whenever Julian laughed at something in his book, low and helpless, like he couldn't quite help responding to the sound. Julian, for his part, had started an entirely undignified ritual of trying to make Gabriel break composure at least once a day. It became something close to a private sport. He read aloud, in the flattest voice he could manage, the most scandalous passages from his trashy court dramas. He narrated Biscuit's increasingly elaborate napping positions like a solemn historian documenting a great battle. He once spent 45 minutes teaching himself to fold paper into a passable imitation of the royal seal, just to see whether Gabriel, mid-signature on an actual treaty, would notice it stamped, upside down, on the corner of his own ledger. Gabriel noticed. Gabriel set his quill down very slowly, looked at the crooked paper seal, looked at Julian's studiously innocent face over the top of his book, and said, with the particular gravity of a man delivering a verdict, "You are going to be the death of this kingdom's diplomatic correspondence. You say that like it's a threat." "I say it," Gabriel said, and here the corner of his mouth finally, helplessly gave. "Because it is becoming, against every instinct I have, one of my favorite parts of the day." Julian did not have a comeback for that. He buried his suddenly warm face back in his book and did not look up again for a very long time, though he was fairly sure, from the quiet, satisfied quality of the silence that followed, that Gabriel knew exactly what he'd done. The first time Julian bit into one, groaned in open, shameless pleasure, and looked up mid-chew to grin at Gabriel with his mouth full. Gabriel laughed, not the clipped, mocking chuckle Julian had heard in council. A real laugh, low and surprised out of him, that lit his whole face up and knocked 10 years off it. Julian's heart did something violent and entirely unauthorized in his chest. This is bad, he thought, staring at the crumbs on his fingers like they'd personally betrayed him. This is very, very bad. Overhearing 4 hours of council meetings a day, Julian learned fast that Windermere's treasury was worse than the book had ever let on. Villages outside the capital were going hungry. Children were dying of cold that better funding could have prevented. Julian remembered, buried in a throwaway line near Chapter 190, that a gold and iron deposit under a place called Hollow Ridge wouldn't be discovered for another 3 years. 3 years was too long. He waited until the last counselor left one night, until Gabriel sat alone with his head in his hands and crossed the room to lean against the desk. "Try Hollow Ridge," Julian said. "Dig at the main gorge, 2 men, 2 days. There's iron and gold under that rock, enough to fund this kingdom for a generation." Gabriel's head came up slowly, gray eyes narrowing. "That ridge is frozen stone. Nothing grows there, nothing's ever been found there. Is this a meridian trap?" "It's not a trap. It's a hunch you're free to ignore," Julian shrugged. "Or you could send 2 guards and find out in 48 hours whether I'm lying. Why would you help me?" Gabriel's voice had gone quiet, almost raw. "If this is real, it makes my kingdom unstoppable. Why hand me that? Because I live here now." Julian looked him dead in the eye. "And a broke kingdom is bad for my personal comfort. That's the whole conspiracy. I promise it's not deeper than that. It absolutely was deeper than that. Neither of them said so." News of the mine spread through the capital faster than Julian expected, and with it came a shift he hadn't anticipated. The common people, who had spent months whispering about the southern viper married into their king's household, started whispering something different instead. He found out about it secondhand, from Nora, who'd overheard two washerwomen gossiping in the courtyard. "They're saying you charmed the mountain into giving up its gold," she reported, delighted, folding a stack of linens with more enthusiasm than the task strictly required. "One of the stable boys is telling everyone you can talk to rocks. Another swears you're secretly a northern-born mage in disguise, sent to save us." "I took a required geology elective in college," Julian said, deeply unhelpfully. "And I read a book. That's the whole secret. Don't tell them that. Let them believe the rocks thing. It's a much better story. It kept happening, in small ways." A baker in the lower town started leaving out a plate of something he called Prince's chicken, a clumsy, delighted imitation of Julian's recipe, sold for half a copper apiece, wildly popular with the dockworkers. A group of children began following Biscuit around the market square like he was visiting royalty, which, Julian supposed, he technically was. When Julian rode through the capital with Gabriel for the first time since the wedding, a formal procession neither of them had wanted, required for some treaty ceremony, Julian had stopped paying attention to the details of the crowd that had once thrown rotten vegetables at effigies of the southern prince during the truce negotiations instead threw flowers, and one particularly enthusiastic grandmother threw an entire fried chicken leg directly into the royal carriage, which Gabriel caught out of the air on pure reflex, and after a long, considering pause, ate. "You're supposed to wave," Julian told him, laughing so hard he had to hold onto the carriage door. "Not catch snacks like a dog. It would have been rude to let it hit the floor," Gabriel said, with total, unbothered dignity, licking a smear of grease off his thumb in a way that Julian found deeply, unfairly distracting for a man who was supposed to be waving at a crowd of several thousand people. "Your subjects are very generous. They're your subjects." "They have decided," Gabriel said, catching Julian's hand and lacing their fingers together in full view of the entire procession, an act of public affection so unlike him that a startled, delighted murmur ran through the crowd like wind through wheat, "that they are also somehow yours. I find I cannot argue with them. Neither, apparently, can I keep my hands off you in public anymore, so you may as well get used to it." Julian did not have a response for that either, which was becoming, he noticed, an alarmingly frequent state of affairs. He settled for lacing his fingers tighter through Gabriel's instead, and let the crowd's cheering wash over both of them, warm as sunlight, all the way back to the palace gates. The dig struck gold on the second day, exactly as promised. Gabriel came to tell him himself, burst into Julian's chambers mid-sentence, breathless with the kind of open joy Julian had never once seen on him, just as Julian was pulling a loose robe over his shoulders after a bath. "Julian, we found it. The whole mountain is." He stopped in the doorway. The robe had slipped. And on Julian's bare back, in the lamplight, were the scars. A dozen thin white lines crossing his shoulder blades, the leftover architecture of a childhood spent being beaten by a father and brother who'd wanted a stronger heir. The silence that followed had weight to it. Gabriel crossed the room without a word and shut the door behind him. Julian felt the temperature of the air change before Gabriel even spoke. That same cold, lethal fury from the garden, except now it wasn't aimed at him. "Who did this to you?" It wasn't a question. Julian swallowed. He thought of the real Julian, the one from the book, who'd carried this alone into an early grave and never told a single soul. "My father," he said quietly. "My brother, mostly. In Meridian, if you're not the golden heir, you're a punching bag with a title." Gabriel reached out, slow, almost disbelieving of his own hand, and laid his palm flat against Julian's shoulder, right over the worst of the scarring. His touch was careful in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with reverence. "I am sorry," he said, and his voice cracked in a place Julian didn't think kings were allowed to crack. "I didn't know." "It's fine," Julian said, and meant it less than he'd meant almost anything. "Old news." Gabriel didn't move his hand. Neither of them mentioned that. Winter arrived hard and fast that year, the kind of cold Julian had never experienced even in Chicago, the kind that turned the palace's ornamental lake into a sheet of glass thick enough to walk on. Oliver had been begging for weeks to be taught to skate, and Gabriel, busy, exhausted, buried under the fallout of a treasury, finally being spent on things that mattered, kept promising next week with the guilty look of a man who knew he was lying. Julian took Oliver himself, borrowing a pair of old blades from the stable master and falling on his backside so many times in the first 10 minutes that Oliver eventually stopped laughing long enough to actually teach him instead. By the time Gabriel found them, cutting through the frozen gardens after a council session that had run 3 hours long, still in his formal coat, looking for all the world like he expected to find a diplomatic crisis, his little brother and his husband were racing each other across the ice, shrieking with laughter, Biscuit sliding along behind them on the frozen surface with all the grace of a dropped sack of flour. "You could have waited for me," Gabriel said, though there was no real accusation in it, just something soft and a little wistful, standing at the lake's edge in his fine boots that were absolutely not made for ice. "You said next week 4 times, Julian called back, skidding to an ungraceful stop near the bank. "We got tired of waiting for the King of Windermere to find a free afternoon." "That's fair." Gabriel looked down at his boots, then at the lake, then, with the particular expression of a man about to do something undignified for love, sat down on the frozen bank and started unlacing them. He was, it turned out, a genuinely terrible skater, all that battlefield grace evaporating the instant his feet hit ice, arms windmilling, dignity abandoned entirely within the first 30 seconds. Julian laughed so hard he nearly fell over again just watching, and when Gabriel finally caught his balance by grabbing 2 fistfuls of Julian's coat and hauling them both nearly off their feet, they ended up in a tangled heap on the ice anyway, breathless. Faces close, Oliver shouting delighted commentary from somewhere behind them and Biscuit attempting, with great enthusiasm and 0 success, to lick both their faces at once. "This is humiliating," Gabriel said, flat on his back, staring up at the winter sky, not moving to get up. "You're the most powerful man on the continent, and you just got beaten in a foot race by a 7-year-old. 8, Oliver corrected primly, skating a slow, superior circle around both of them. "I turned 8 in autumn. Try to keep up." "I stand corrected," Julian said, and turned his head to find Gabriel already looking at him, close enough that their breath fogged together in the freezing air, close enough that neither of them needed to say what came next before it happened. A slow, unhurried kiss, cold-lipped and laughing, right there on the ice in front of an audience of 1 delighted 8-year-old and 1 deeply unbothered dog. "I could get used to this," Gabriel said, quiet when they finally broke apart. "All of it, the ice, the dog. You laughing at me. I did not know before you that a life could look like this and still belong to a king." "Get up," Julian said, throat tight in a way he wasn't ready to examine too closely, hauling Gabriel upright by both hands instead of answering directly. "Your subjects are staring, and Oliver's about to lap us again. Lord Percival Ashworth, 27, son of Windermere's Prime Minister and Gabriel's closest friend since childhood, or so the court believes. Handsome, charming, endlessly generous with his smiles, and privately convinced that the throne beside Gabriel was always meant to be his." Percival started appearing in the study more and more, always with a reason: treasury concerns, temple donations, some crisis that always seemed to require just a private word, "Your Majesty." Gabriel, without looking up from his desk, would say, "You can speak in front of Julian. He's my husband. I keep no secrets from him." Julian watched, delighted and slightly stunned, as something ugly flickered across Percival's handsome face before the pleasant mask slid back into place. "Of course," Percival said smoothly. "My apologies." "I only meant," he smiled at Julian, warm as sunshine, cold as the bottom of a well. "It's remarkable how quickly you've settled in, Your Highness, given how briefly you've known each other. It became a pattern." Percival, reminiscing about childhood summers with Gabriel. Percival, mentioning, always lightly, always in passing, that everyone had assumed he'd be the one to marry the king before the Southern truce got in the way. He cornered Julian once, alone, in the long gallery outside the throne room, all smiles and silk and studied warmth. "You must find all this terribly overwhelming," Percival said, falling into step beside him. "A foreign court, a husband who barely speaks to strangers, a marriage arranged over a battlefield. It's a great deal to ask of anyone." He let the pause sit just a beat too long. "Gabriel and I grew up together, you understand. Summers at Ashworth Hall. I used to know what he was thinking before he did. I only say this because I'd hate for you to be hurt, expecting more from him than he's built to give." That's very thoughtful of you, Julian said, in the same pleasant, empty tone he'd once used on customers he was actively planning to hang up on. Almost like you rehearsed it. Something flickered behind Percival's smile, there and gone fast as a blade sheathed. I only want what's best for him. Sure you do. Julian smiled back, wide and guileless and utterly unconvinced. Well, this has been illuminating. I have a dog to feed and a husband who delightfully does speak to me. Enjoy the gallery. He walked away without waiting for a response, and it was only once he'd turned the corner that he let the smile drop, his pulse ticking up with something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite anger. Recognition, maybe, of a man who'd smiled at him with exactly that same practiced warmth once before, back in a fluorescent-lit office in another life, right before laying him off over video call. I know your type, Julian thought. I've been managed by your type, and I did not survive falling off a building to get managed again. That night, alone with Gabriel by the study fire, Julian found himself saying with a casualness he didn't feel, "You know, if you wanted to marry Percival instead, I wouldn't stand in the way. Take him as consort. Divorce me. I'll take a little house in the countryside and a lifetime supply of fried chicken and call it even." The chair Gabriel had been sitting in hit the floor. He was around the desk before Julian had finished the sentence, closing the distance not with violence but with something worse. A slow, deliberate, unstoppable advance that stole the air out of the room. He stopped a breath from Julian, closer than he'd ever stood, his scent gone sharp and wild with something that wasn't just anger. "You'd hand me away that easily?" His voice had dropped to something low and rough, barely leashed. "Bargain me off for your quiet little life?" His hand rose, hovering just beside Julian's jaw, fingers trembling with the effort of not touching. "Tell me who's stolen your thoughts, Julian, because I am burning down in front of you, and you're negotiating my remarriage like a land dispute." "Gabriel, I have never been more clear-headed in my life." And then the last thread snapped, and he closed the distance himself, kissing Julian like a man who'd spent months talking himself out of exactly this. It was not gentle. It tasted like honey cakes and restraint finally giving out, like every unspoken afternoon in that study collapsing into one moment. Julian's hands found the front of Gabriel's coat and held on, because the floor had apparently stopped being reliable. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Julian did what any sensible transmigrated corporate accountant would do. He panicked completely, ducked under Gabriel's arm, and fled the room at a dead sprint. He locked his own door and stood with his back against it, heart slamming, face on fire. "I am so screwed," he thought. "I have fallen completely, catastrophically in love with the alpha-eating Omega King of the frozen north." The next morning, walking the outer gardens to try to outpace his own racing thoughts, Julian found Percival waiting in the shadow of a hedge, his charming mask entirely gone. "Did you truly think a southern mutt could hold a place in his heart?" Percival hissed, closing in. "Gabriel only tolerates you because he's merciful. You do not belong here." Before Julian could answer, Percival grabbed his wrist, nails digging in hard enough to draw blood, and then, with a gasp Julian recognized a half-second too late as Theodore flung himself backward onto the gravel path. "Someone help me! My ankle!" he shrieked, and his attendants materialized from the nearby hedges as if they'd been waiting for the cue, which, Julian realized with growing horror, they absolutely had. The Southern Prince attacked Lord Percival. Out of jealousy. "You have got to be kidding me," Julian thought, staring at the whole tableau. "This is the most theatrical crime scene I have ever witnessed." Gabriel arrived at a run with half the guard behind him, and Percival, bless his commitment to the bit, was already crying beautifully by the time the king reached them. "Don't punish him, Gabriel," Percival wept, radiant with false forgiveness. "It's my fault. I shouldn't have startled him. He's your husband. I'm nothing." Julian's stomach dropped. It looked, objectively, terrible. "Julian." Gabriel's voice was flat, unreadable. "Come with me." He obeyed, dread pooling low and cold, and the second the door of Gabriel's private chamber shut behind them, he grabbed 2 fistfuls of the king's coat. "I swear on everything, I did not touch him." He grabbed my wrist and threw himself down like it was choreographed. "I know how it sounds." "I know," Gabriel said quietly. "I was on the upper balcony. I watched the whole thing." Julian blinked. "Then why did you drag me out in front of everyone like a criminal?" Gabriel took his scratched wrist, gentle as he'd been in the garden weeks ago, and pulled a small jar of salve from the desk drawer without answering right away. He knelt, the second time he'd knelt for Julian since the wedding, and began working the salve into the cuts with slow, deliberate care. "Because I needed to touch you," he admitted, not looking up, "and I could not do it in front of my whole court without every one of them knowing exactly how far gone I am." Julian looked down at the crown of that dark head bent over his wrist, at the man who had just publicly humiliated himself to buy 30 seconds of privacy, and felt whatever remained of his self-preservation instinct quietly leave the building. He leaned down and kissed him first, this time. What happened after that is, as they say, not for the record, except to note that a small jar of salve rolled off the desk and was entirely forgotten until well past dawn, and that somewhere around 3 in the morning, tangled together in the quiet dark with Gabriel's heartbeat slow and steady under his ear, Julian finally said out loud the thing he'd been carrying silent since the study, since the honey cakes, since a dungeon-scented flood of memory on his very first morning in this world. "I love you," he said. Into the dark, half-certain Gabriel had already fallen asleep. "For what it's worth, I know we didn't exactly start this the normal way." Gabriel's arm tightened around him, and his voice, when it came, was rough with something that hadn't fully recovered from the night. "It's worth everything," he said. "It's worth more than everything. I have been in love with you, I think, since a dungeon report about fried chicken and a badly behaved dog made me laugh harder than I had in 4 years, and I have simply been too much of a coward to say so before you did. You're the least cowardly person I've ever met. You've personally led 4 military campaigns." Loving someone, Gabriel said, quiet and honest in a way kings weren't supposed to be able to afford, was always going to be the harder battle. Julian pressed closer, tucked his face against Gabriel's collarbone, and didn't say anything else, because there wasn't anything else that needed saying, just the two of them, and the low, warm hum of 2 cents settling into something that finally, unmistakably, matched. The following weeks were, against every reasonable expectation, happy ones. The Hollow Ridge mine kept producing. Julian shared basic ideas about crop rotation and clean well water that quietly saved more lives than any battle Gabriel had ever won. When his father's threatening letters arrived from Meridian, Gabriel and Julian read them aloud by the fire like bad theater reviews and fed them to the flames together, laughing. It didn't last. It never was going to. Not in a book that had once ended with an execution. Gabriel came into Julian's chambers in full black war armor, face grim as a closed door. "Meridian has declared open war. Your brother leads their army. I have to ride for the front tonight." Julian's throat closed. This was near enough the exact turning point of the book, except this time he hadn't leaked a single secret to anyone. Why was the war still happening? "Take this," he said, pressing the single truly awful embroidered handkerchief he'd ever finished. The flowers looked like a crime scene, into Gabriel's gauntleted hand. "For luck, come back, promise me." Gabriel kissed his forehead, hard and lingering. "I promise you, Julian, I will come home." He rode out that same afternoon. By evening, Imperial guards were dragging Julian out of his own chambers in chains. "Prince Julian of Meridian," the commander announced coldly, "you're under arrest for high treason. Stolen war plans were found beneath your floorboards, sealed with your own signet." "That's a lie," Julian shouted, struggling. "I've been here every single day. Ask anyone." Nobody asked anyone. The forged letters were convincing. The maps were real, planted, damning. With Gabriel gone, the counselors loyal to Percival's father moved fast, and by nightfall Julian was in the deepest cell of the palace dungeon, waiting for a king who might not return in time to save him. The cell was smaller than James had ever imagined a dungeon could be, barely wide enough to lie down in, the stone floor damp and cold enough to bite through his robes, a single high slit of a window, letting in a thin blade of moonlight that told him nothing about how much time was passing. Somewhere down the corridor, water dripped in a rhythm that felt, after the first hour, almost deliberate, like the building itself was counting down something Julian couldn't see. Sitting on cold stone with his wrists chained, Julian forced his racing corporate brain to do the one thing it was actually good at: pattern recognition. If real plans had leaked, then the war was tracking the book's plot exactly, which meant Meridian's army was about to spring an ambush at a river crossing called Thornwell Pass, and King Gabriel, riding straight into it, would nearly die. He thought about the fire in the study, the honey cakes, the ugly handkerchief pressed into a gauntleted hand, and the promise made against his forehead. He thought, with a clarity that startled him, that he had spent 29 years in one life without ever once loving anyone enough to be this afraid for them, and it had taken falling off a building and getting a second, borrowed life to finally understand what that particular kind of fear felt like. Cold and total, worse than any deadline, worse than any fall. Not like this, he thought, pressing his forehead against his knees. I did not survive dying once, just to lose him to a plot twist I already know is coming. Absolutely not, Julian thought. Not on my watch, buddy. At midnight, a furious 8-year-old scream came echoing down the dungeon stairs. I don't care if it's forbidden. I want to see my brother-in-law, and if you don't let me past, I will have my brother throw every single one of you in the snow. Oliver, throwing the tantrum of the century, drew every guard's attention toward the stairwell, and under cover of the chaos, a shaking Nora slipped down the side corridor with a stolen key ring. Your Highness, hurry. A horse is waiting at the east gate. Julian didn't need telling twice. He rode 2 days without sleep, pushing the horse to its absolute limit, navigating by nothing but memory of a web novel he'd read on a lunch break in a different lifetime. When he finally reached the war camp at the edge of Thornwell Pass, the horse collapsed under him in the mud, and 3 Vanguard soldiers tackled him before he'd even caught his breath. Spy! We've got a Meridian spy sniffing round the perimeter. They dragged him, filthy and bleeding, straight into the command tent, where King Gabriel Sterling, soot-streaked and hollow-eyed with exhaustion, turned around and went absolutely white. Julian. He was across the tent in 2 strides, shoving guards aside to catch him before he hit the ground. What are you doing here? Do you know how dangerous? Listen to me. Julian grabbed the front of his armor, breathless. I was arrested. Someone leaked real plans and framed me for it, but that means whatever crossing plan you've got for tomorrow is already known. Thornwell Pass is a trap. They're waiting in the cliffs. The generals in the tent erupted in protest. He's a Meridian prince. This is exactly what a trap looks like. But Gabriel looked into Julian's face, saw the mud, the blood, the sheer terror underneath the certainty, and made his decision in under 3 seconds. New plan. We flank from the west ridge at dawn. Move, Your Majesty, with respect. Move. With Julian's memory of the book's battle geography feeding real-time intelligence, the Northern Army didn't just avoid the trap. They turned it inside out, catching Meridian's forces from the flank and shattering them by midday. By the 3rd day, they'd captured the enemy commander leading the charge, Julian's own brother, Crown Prince Desmond Ashby, bound in chains in a secluded tent. Desmond looked up when Julian entered alone that night and laughed, bloody and bitter. The useless second son. Look at you, playing hero. Doesn't matter. Once they learn it was Percival feeding secrets north the whole time, not you, they'll still find a way to blame it on the southern mutt. Even your precious king won't be able to save you from that. Julian let his expression crumple, panic, despair, all of it fake as Percival's ankle injury. Why would he do that to me? Ego, Desmond sneered, delighted. You always were an idiot. You always did talk too much, Julian said softly and smiled. Also, this tent canvas is remarkably thin. King Gabriel and every general in this camp have been standing right outside the whole time. The tent flap tore open. Gabriel stepped through, flanked by his stunned commanders, eyes gone flat and lethal. Ride to the capital tonight, he told his chief general, voice like a closing door. Bring Lord Percival Ashworth in chains, and bring the maids who swore the false testimony with him. As guards hauled a screaming Desmond away, Julian sagged against Gabriel's shoulder, drained down to nothing. It's over, Gabriel murmured into his hair, arms locked around him like he intended never to let go again. You're safe. We're all safe. Good, Julian said, muffled against his chest. Because I am starving and I would sell state secrets for a plate of fried chicken right now. Gabriel's laugh, real, warm, entirely unguarded, was the best sound Julian had heard in either of his lives. Percival's scheme unraveled fast once the guards started pulling threads. He'd been the one leaking court secrets south for months, buying Meridian silence about his own gambling debts, and hoping the chaos of a war would sweep him into the throne beside Gabriel once Julian was executed. His father lost his ministry within the week. Percival lost considerably more than that. Julian's own father, watching his best general captured and his spy network exposed in the same fortnight, sued for a peace far less generous than the last one. This time, Gabriel dictated every term, and every term favored the people who'd nearly starved in the last decade of war. Julian's brother Desmond was sent home in chains as part of the new treaty terms, to face whatever justice Meridian's own court saw fit, though Julian, watching him dragged onto the southbound wagon, felt considerably less satisfaction in it than he'd expected. He'd spent weeks imagining that moment as a triumph. Instead, standing at the gate with Gabriel's hand warm at the small of his back, he mostly just felt tired and lighter, like he'd finally set down something he'd been carrying without realizing how heavy it was. "You don't have to feel anything about it," Gabriel said quietly, reading his face the way he'd apparently learned to do without Julian noticing when it started. "Not triumph, not grief. Whatever you feel is allowed to just be what it is. When did you get so wise about feelings? You spent our wedding night informing me of a murder plot in the same tone you'd use to discuss taxes." "I have had," Gabriel said dryly, "an extremely educational marriage. Word of the whole affair. The frame-up, the ambush, the southern prince who'd ridden 2 days on no sleep to save a war he had every reason to let happen, spread through the capital faster than the gold rumors ever had. By the time the wagon carrying Desmond disappeared past the gates, half the lower town had turned out just to watch, and someone in the crowd started it, and within a minute the whole street had picked it up. 'Not the villain, not the villain, not the villain,' chanted like a football chorus, entirely undignified and entirely sincere, until Julian had to duck his burning face against Gabriel's shoulder to hide how hard he was laughing and how close he was, at the exact same time, to crying. 6 months later, on a bright, ordinary spring afternoon, King Gabriel Sterling remarried his own husband in a small, private ceremony in the palace gardens, not because the law required it, but because Gabriel insisted the first wedding had been a political transaction, and this one, he said, would be a true one. Oliver, now 8 and utterly insufferable about it, served as ring-bearer, and cried louder than anyone in attendance, including Nora. Julian wore blue. Gabriel cried during the vows and denied it fiercely for the rest of the evening. Biscuit, now enormous and entirely spoiled, wore a tiny wreath of flowers and immediately ate it. Somewhere in the archives of Meridian, a scandalized court historian was already drafting a very different ending to the Omega King's downfall, one where the villain, against every expectation the story had ever set for him, got to live. 3 years into their marriage, King Gabriel Sterling, feared across 2 kingdoms, veteran of 4 major campaigns, a man who had once made a room of hardened generals go silent with a single look, could not, for the life of him, win an argument about breakfast. "It is chicken, Gabriel. Fried chicken." "It is incredible, and you know it, and you're only saying that because Nora complained again." Nora did not complain. Nora sighed, which is worse, and then she told the kitchen to make you porridge as well, in case you come to your senses. Gabriel took the drumstick out of Julian's hand, took a bite anyway, made a small pained noise of betrayal at how good it was, and handed it back. "This is not a victory for you. It's absolutely a victory for me. Look at your face." Biscuit, now old and gray around the muzzle, and thoroughly done with both of them, thumped his tail once from his spot by the fire without lifting his head, as if to say, "I have seen this argument 17 times, and it always ends the same way." It did. It ended with Gabriel stealing a second piece, purely for quality control, and Julian pretending to be outraged about it. Court gossip about the king and his southern-born husband had shifted, over 3 years, from scandal to something closer to civic pride. The mine at Hollow Ridge had funded 3 new hospitals. The crop rotation Julian had half remembered from a high school biology class had ended the worst famine in Windermere's living memory, and the king, cold, unreadable King Gabriel, whom half the continent still quietly feared, had developed, in full view of his entire court, an expression that his own council had started calling the Julian face, soft around the eyes, faintly stunned, entirely undefended, and impossible to hide no matter how hard he tried. He tried very hard. He failed constantly. "Your Majesty," his master of arms had reported once, entirely straight-faced, during a war council, "the scouting report from the eastern border." "Fine, proceed," Gabriel said, not looking up from where Julian was sprawled on the council room couch, half asleep with Biscuit's head in his lap, one hand still lazily scratching the dog's ears in his sleep. "Sir, you're doing the face again. There is no face. Sir, respectfully, there has never once not been a face since the wedding." Julian, eyes still closed, smirked without opening them. "He's right, you know. You get this look like someone hit you with a very soft, very expensive pillow. I am ending this council session. Gabriel announced with tremendous dignity, standing, crossing the room, and bodily lifting Julian off the couch, dog and all, Biscuit yelping in outraged protest at being dislodged, to carry him out over one shoulder while the entire war council pretended very hard not to laugh. "We are done for today, Gabriel. Gabriel, my crown fell off. Gabriel, everyone can see up my robe." "Good," Gabriel said, entirely unbothered, already halfway down the corridor. "Let them see how thoroughly I've won." Oliver, now 11 and increasingly convinced of his own importance, had taken to appointing himself chief advisor on all matters relating to his brother-in-law, a title nobody had given him, and nobody could seem to take away. He arrived at breakfast most mornings uninvited, helped himself to whatever fried food was available without asking, and delivered opinions on state matters with the total, unshakable confidence unique to 11-year-olds and, apparently, kings. "You should let him build the second kitchen," Oliver announced one morning, through a mouthful of biscuit, jabbing a fork in Julian's general direction. "He keeps talking about it. He drew you a whole diagram. It's a very good diagram." "It is a very good diagram," Julian agreed, delighted to have backup. "The Treasury," Gabriel said without looking up from his tea, "does not currently allocate funds for a second kitchen whose sole purpose is your husband's ambition to recreate something called a waffle iron." "The Treasury," Julian said, "is currently funded by a mine I found with my brain." "I think I've earned a waffle iron." "He's got you there," Oliver said solemnly, and stole the last piece of bacon off his brother's plate while Gabriel was still formulating a rebuttal. The second kitchen was built within the month. Gabriel complained about it the entire time, ate breakfast in it every single day once it was finished, and never once admitted that he'd personally approved the budget line himself, 3 days before Julian had even asked. Later, much later, curled together in the wide dark of their own bed, with Biscuit snoring pointedly at the foot of it, Julian traced the old, faded silver scars along the back of his own shoulder, the ones that had once been the ugliest part of his second life, and found for the first time in either of his lives that they didn't feel like a wound anymore, just a place a good man had once put his hand, and decided without asking permission to stay. "What are you thinking about?" Gabriel murmured against his hair, voice thick with sleep. "That I fell off a building in Chicago and woke up married to a war criminal with excellent cheekbones. I am not a war criminal. You have absolutely committed several war crimes. Every one of them was very justified," Gabriel said, tightening his arm around Julian's waist, mouth curving against his shoulder. "Go to sleep, my prince. We have a council session at 9, and I intend to fall asleep in it out of spite if you keep me up talking. You love me." "Unfortunately," Gabriel agreed, sounding entirely hopelessly delighted about it. "Go to sleep." Outside, the northern kingdom of Windermere slept on beneath a sky full of stars neither of them, in either life, had ever seen anywhere so clear, and somewhere in the palace kitchens, a batch of fried chicken sat cooling for breakfast, exactly as ordered, because even a king, it turned out, could be talked into anything by the right kind of love. Somewhere far to the south, in a kingdom he no longer thought of as home, a court historian was still arguing with his editor about how to end the chapter where the villain was supposed to die. Somewhere much closer, an old dog with one ear that never stood upright shifted in his sleep and sighed, content. And somewhere in between the life James Calloway had lost on a Chicago fire escape and the one Julian Ashby had built out of stubbornness, fried chicken, and one impossible, ice-cold, ferociously loyal Omega King, a man who had once promised himself things would get easier, and never believed it finally, quietly, completely did. If Julian's chaos and charm survival plan is exactly the kind of nonsense your day needed, drop a comment and tell us which moment had you the most invested. Hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next unhinged royal love story. Thank you so much for sticking around till the end.